In June of 1943, American servicemen took to the streets of Los Angeles, not to fight the enemy overseas, obviously, because they're not in Los Angeles,
Right.
but to hunt down teenagers in oversized suits, dragging them out of theaters, beating them in public, setting their clothes on fire, all while police stood by and arrests were made against the victims. Depending on who you ask, this was either a brutal racial attack or the explosion of a city already on edge, where gang violence, wartime pressure, and resentment had been building for months. The truth of what actually happened sits somewhere in the middle, as it usually does, buried under headlines, politics, and decades of conflicting stories.
Plus, it was California.
Outlaws and gunslingers. Real stories, the way they actually happened. Well, speaking of how did we get here in California, by the early 20th century, Los Angeles had become one of the largest Mexican communities outside of Mexico.
Makes sense.
By 1930, the population had reached about 150,000, making it second only to Mexico City.
Wow.
That growth didn't happen by accident either. It was driven by steady waves of immigration tied to labor demands and railroads, agriculture, and emerging industries across SoCal, Southern California. Many of those workers settled in segregated neighborhoods known as barrios, particularly in East LA. You guys remember East LA? Yeah. That's where opportunity and hardship existed side by side, and getting away from it.
Then, guess what happened, boys? Great Depression. Everything shifted, and it shifted quickly. 1929 to 1936, local authorities in LA carried out aggressive repatriation campaigns. Officials, they claimed that it would reduce the strain on welfare during the economic collapse. But in all reality, 35,000 Mexicans and Mexican Americans were deported. Or, well, it sounds like today, huh? They were deported or pressured into leaving the country. This was roughly 1/3 of the city's Mexican population at that very time. What made it even more troubling? Well, many of those forced out actually United States citizens. Even after the disruption, the community did not disappear. By 1940, it partially rebuilt through natural population growth and limited return migration. And the population once again exceeded 150,000. So you ain't getting rid of us that quick, boys. Most were still concentrated in the same barrios, where overcrowding, substandard housing remained a constant reality.
So are we talking about now or back then?
Right.
You know?
Within that very environment, Mexican Americans were largely pushed into low-wage work. They filled roles in manufacturing, including canaries. Including canneries and garment factories. Others worked in agriculture on the edges of the city, or they even took on manual labor and transportation. 1930, they made up nearly 1/3 of California's Mexican workforce in manufacturing. This is despite being a smaller share of the overall population. That very level of economic marginalization, it fed directly into urban poverty. 1930s reports began to highlight rising rates of juvenile delinquency among Mexican American youth. These reports pointed to increasing street crime and the emergence of youth gangs in the barrios. Many of those issues were tied to family disruptions caused by repatriations and the lack of real economic opportunity. I mean, it's tough.
It's tough. Finish that, man. At the same time, tensions between groups, they were already building. Many Anglo residents, they viewed Mexicans as outsiders and associated them with violence.
Oh.
These perceptions were reinforced by media portrayals and by the practices of the LAPD, which frequently, these guys just can't seem to get their shit together, can they? They frequently focused patrols and arrests in Mexican neighborhoods. Police data from the era showed Mexicans were overrepresented in arrests for assaults, which compared to their share of the population.
Right.
So, that reality was shaped by more than just crime. It reflected the conditions inside overcrowded barrios and effects of selective enforcement.
Right.
Over time, perception and policing fed into each other, creating a cycle that deepened divisions and set the stage for what we're about to cover.
Ooh-wee.
As we all know, it's the 40s, United States. They enter World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Almost immediately, the country shifted into full mobilization, turning LA into a major hub for military training, shipbuilding, and aircraft production. By 43, the city was swelling with defense workers and their families. That rapid growth pushed an already strained housing system to the breaking point. Overcrowding became a daily reality. Housing shortages forced many people into shared or substandard living conditions, and the infrastructure simply just couldn't keep up. Materials and resources, they were being prioritized for the war. At the same time, these new job opportunities in war industries, they brought different groups into close contact. People that were living in Kansas all their damn life, now they're on the West Coast. in LA culture. Wow.
Right. Yeah, they're like, what the hell's this?
Which included migrants from rural areas and minority communities, all competing for the same jobs and living space, which only added to the growing tension. Top of all that, by early 43, more than 50,000 servicemen had flooded into the LA area. Many, they were living in temporary barracks or staying with local families while waiting for deployment. These are mostly young men, far from home, with time to kill and people to kill, apparently, and nowhere consistent to go. They filled up the downtown theaters, bars, and dance halls looking for some kind of release, but even that had limits. Wartime blackout restrictions put in place to guard against possible air raids after incidents like the so-called Battle of L.A.
Right.
It meant nighttime activity was heavily controlled. That only added to the frustration. On top of that, gasoline rationing, rolled out by the Office of Price Administration starting in 42, it limited how far people could even go. Civilians and servicemen alike, they were stuck in the same crowded public transportations, which added just one more layer of tension to daily life. You're stacking it all on top of each other.
Right. Damn. Meanwhile, federal government tightening control over resources in every direction. The War Production Board, established in January of 1942, began enforcing strict fabric rationing by March. Materials like wool, silk, redirected toward uniforms, parachutes. Civilian clothing, restricted.
That's crazy.
With suit widths capped at 40 inches and vests at 32 inches. On paper, it made sense for the war effort, but in practice, it created resentment. At a time when people were already dealing with shortages across the board, anything that looked like excess or waste stood out. And at that very same time, there was growing concern about what was happening with the younger people. The terrible J. Edgar Hoover.
Boover.
He reported a sharp increase in juvenile delinquency during 1942.
Oh, he personally observed that, right?
Arrests of people under 21 rose, and it rose significantly, including more than 15,000 cases involving females alone.
Females acting up. To what else is new?
Right. Reports pointed to increases in the gang activity and petty crime, and much of that was tied right back to the disruptions caused by the war itself. Parents working long hours in defense jobs. Families stretched thin. Young people left unsupervised with little structure and limited opportunity. When you combine all of that with the overcrowding, shortages, the constant pressure of wartime life, the city, well, it starts to see some strain. This is where small problems were beginning to stack up into something much bigger. The Zoot Suit, well, did not start in L.A. This first showed up in jazz clubs in Harlem.
You've all seen the little videos of the black clubs. Those people are dressed to the nines. That movie, Harlem Nights.
Yep.
Isn't that set in that time?
I believe so.
They were wearing zoot suits, kind of.
This was the mid to late 1930s. This is where style, it was already tied closely to music, identity, and attitude. The look stood out immediately. Long coats, padded shoulders, high-waisted trousers that narrowed at the ankle, an overall oversized silhouette that used a lot more fabric than standard clothing. It was bold, it was flashy, impossible to ignore. More than anything, it represented a break from traditional menswear, a way of pushing back against the idea that you had to dress a certain way. By the early 40s, that style had made its way across the country, taking hold amongst the Mexican-American youth in L.A. Well, this is where it became closely tied to what was known as the Pachuco subculture. For many of these young men, the Zoot Suit was not just about fashion. It became a symbol of cultural resistance. At a time when there was strong pressure to assimilate into mainstream Anglo-American society, wearing that very Zoot Suit was a way of standing apart and saying, guess what, boys? I'm not going to blend in with you guys just because you say so. I'm my own man.
Or woman.
Right.
Pachucos, they represented a distinct identity, especially among second-generation Mexican-Americans who were growing up between two worlds. They combined elements of Mexican heritage with American urban culture. That showed up in how they dressed, how they spoke, and how they carried themselves. The style included zoot suits, slick pompadour hairstyles, and it's basically, think about Bruno Mars.
Right.
That kind of hairstyle, but in a zoot suit. And the use of calo, which is a unique form of slang that blended English with Mexican Spanish, trace its roots back to older Spanish dialects influenced by Romani speech.
Oh, so it's Italian.
It was not just communication. It was a way of signaling who you were and where you belonged. This identity wasn't limited to men either. Women, known as pachucas, they were part of the same cultural shift. They wore modified versions of the style, including rolled-up pants, saddle shoes, and carefully styled hair like finger waves.
Oh, nice.
Hair like finger waves, right? In doing that, they challenged traditional expectations within Mexican culture that emphasized modesty and more conservative roles for women. At the same time, they were making a clear statement of belonging to the same group and movement. As these groups form, they often organize around neighborhoods, and that neighborhoods, they organize around cities, and those cities organize
around states. States around countries, countries around oceans.
Right, and the world.
There it is.
Right. And that sometimes led to territorial disputes. Reports from the time pointed to fights, muggings, clashes between groups.
I mean, you're gonna.
Especially among the youth trying to defend their area or reputation. That fed into growing concern from authorities and the public. They were already uneasy about what they saw as rising delinquency.
Oh.
Critics were quick to label Pachucos as unpatriotic, especially during wartime. The Zoot Suit itself became part of that criticism, believing it required so much fabric. Many believed it violated wartime rationing efforts.
Get out of here.
There were accusations that suits were being made through black market tailors.
Oh, my goodness.
There are also reports, some exaggerated, some not, of harassment involving servicemen and women.
Oh.
All that added to the image of Pachucos as criminal and disloyal. But from the perspective of those wearing the suits, it meant something very different. For many, the Zoot Suit was about pride, identity, control over how they were seen. In a city where they were often marginalized and targeted, it was just their way of claiming space and defining themselves on their own terms.
Okay, I like it. It was August 1st, late in the evening. A large party broke out near the Williams Ranch Reservoir. It's a spot that locals called Sleepy Lagoon. It's on the southeast side of L.A. The crowds, well, mostly Mexican-American youth. Many of them tied in some way to the growing Pachuco scene. And as the night went on, tensions that had been building for a while, guess what? Finally boiled over.
You forgot to put that wood spoon over the top of the pan.
Right. There's a fight, and it broke out between members of the 38th Street Gang and a rival group from the nearby Downey area. Part of an ongoing back and forth between neighborhood groups that had been simmering long before this very night. And guess what? Who's in the middle of that chaos? None other than Jose Gallardo Diaz. He's a 22-year-old Mexican-American who was not officially part of either group, but he knew people on the 38th Street side.
That's all you got to know.
Right. Some point during the fight, Diaz, he stepped in, and that decision cost him.
Yeah, it did.
Beaten badly by a group using blunt objects, left unconscious in a ditch near the reservoir. 4 days later, 5th of August, his body found in the water, about 150 feet from where the party had taken place. The autopsy, conducted by the L.A. County coroner Frank Webb, well, he determined that Diaz, he died from cerebral concussion caused by multiple blows to his head with a blunt instrument. No stab wounds, no gunshot wounds. The report also noted that he had been intoxicated at the time of the incident, which likely made him more vulnerable during the attack. He went to sleep with the concussion. That's why you don't go to sleep with the concussion.
Well, I don't think he had a choice.
Right. Once the body discovered the LAPD, they moved quickly. Their focus zeroed in on Mexican-American youth, particularly those connected to the 38th Street Gang. Investigators questioned more than 600 individuals. It was a wide net, and it was not subtle. Out of that, 24 young men between the ages of 15 and 21 formally charged with murder and conspiracy to commit.
Wow.
All of them associated in some way with the 38th Street Gang. The way they handled after the arrest only added to controversy. They were held without bail, kept in isolation so they could not communicate with each other. They were denied access to clean clothing and basic grooming. By the time they appeared in court, they looked disheveled and unkempt, which did not go unnoticed by the jury or the public.
Bet it didn't.
Oh, my.
Well, the old trial itself, known as People versus Zamora et al., began in October 1942 under Judge Charles Frick. Instead of separate trials, it was handled as one large mass proceeding.
Ooh, that's fucked up.
Involving all 22 defendants after 2 of the charges were dropped. Prosecutors argued that this wasn't just a fight that got out of control. They claimed it was a coordinated act tied to gang rivalry, pointing to witness statements about the beating and to the fact that the defendants largely remained silent after the arrest.
Wow.
That silence was framed as part of a so-called Pachuco Code,
Right.
the idea that members would not cooperate with authorities, and it became a central piece of the prosecution's argument as the case moved forward. This doesn't make sense. So, maybe there's 2 versions. He was either found dead in the reservoir or he was taken to the hospital and died there with stab wounds.
And, yeah, well.
January 13th, 1943, the jury came back with its verdict, and it was a sweeping one. 17 of the defendants convicted. 3 were found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life.
Oh.
9 convicted of second degree, receiving terms ranging from 5 to life.
Okay.
The remaining 5 were convicted of assault with a deadly weapon and given sentences between 1 and 10.
Oh.
What stood out immediately was the lack of direct physical evidence tying any specific individual to the fatal blows that actually killed Jose.
Oh.
The case leaned heavily on circumstantial testimony, much of it coming from witnesses who were hesitant to even speak and openly admitted they feared retaliation if they did.
Right. What can you do? Damn. As that very trial unfolded, a number of procedural issues raised serious concerns. The very defense repeatedly pushed for a separate trial, arguing that trying all the defense together made it clearly impossible to sort out what was responsible, or who was responsible, or exactly what happened. The judge says, we're going to try them all at once. Defendants were also limited in their ability to consult with their attorneys during the proceedings. That's illegal, which further complicated their defense. Inside that courtroom, they were physically separated from their families, creating an atmosphere that felt more controlled than impartial. Prosecutors defended these measures, claiming they were necessary because there had been all kinds of signs of witness intimidations from individuals that they believed to be connected to the gang activity. After that verdict, criticism came quickly, and it came from multiple directions. Defense attorneys and later appeals pointed directly at Judge Charles Frick. They argued that his instructions to the jury blurred the line between individual responsibility and group association. By framing Pachuco behavior as evidence of collective guilt, critics said the court allowed the jury to convict without clear proof of who exactly committed the crime. Throughout the trial, prosecutors leaned hard on the idea of gang dynamics. They suggested that the group itself operated as a unit, and that silence or lack of cooperation only reinforced that narrative. Add all that and combine it with testimony from reluctant witnesses, the argument became the backbone of the conspiracy charge and ultimately played a major role in securing the convictions.
By May of 43, tensions in L.A., they were no longer just simmering in the background. You got this. You got all the people stacked on top of each other, basically. They're also starting to show up in reports, complaints, and daily confrontations. The 11th Naval District headquarters, they began receiving multiple complaints from servicemen. They said they had been assaulted by groups of Pachucos while off duty in downtown areas. These incidents, they often started with verbal exchanges, but they didn't always stay that way. Police records documented at least 26 cases involving servicemen since March of that year. And naval officials believe the real number was probably over 50.
Right.
Many of these encounters followed a similar pattern, with Pachucos approaching sailors, sometimes directing taunts at them, or making advances toward their female companions, which quickly escalated into conflict. What do you expect to happen?
Right. I mean, come on, guys. Shit.
Dealing with trained killers.
All right.
Psychopaths. For the servicemen, this went beyond a few isolated fights. There was a growing perception that Pachucos, they weren't just confrontational. They were avoiding military service altogether, while others were being sent overseas. In the middle of a war, that idea hit a nerve. The Zoot Suit itself became part of the frustration. To many servicemen, it looked like excess during a time of rationing. It was seen as a visible sign that defiance rather than a fashion choice. And it was seen as a visible sign of defiance rather than just fashion. That perception hardened attitudes and made every interaction feel just a little more personal.
Ooh, you like that personal feeling, don't you? Well, 30th of May, 1943, things take a serious turn. Started as a verbal altercation between United States sailors and a group of Zoot Suiters, escalated quickly into a violent beating. There was a sailor named Joe Dacey Coleman. He was attacked near downtown L.A., injured badly enough that he had to be hospitalized. The incident spread quickly through the ranks. Many servicemen were already dealing with long deployments, limited time off, and stress that came with wartime life, so these guys were pissed. Plus, you add in alcohol, frustration, and boredom. They're already there.
You don't even need the frustration.
Right. Coleman's beating became a tipping point. In the days that followed, groups of sailors began taking matters in their own hands. Without any official orders, they started forming informal patrols. They moved through the city, looking for Zoot Suiters to confront.
Oh, jeez.
By early June, these groups no longer random. They were organized, and organized enough to move together. And many were carrying makeshift weapons. Well, at that very same time, the violence, not one-sided. Reports from June 1st describe continued clashes, including incidents where isolated sailors were beaten by larger groups of Pachucos in areas like Chinatown.
What the hell?
Right, what the hell? From this perspective
Right.
From this perspective of many servicemen, it kind of felt like they were being targeted, and that local authorities were not doing enough to protect them. That belief only pushed them further toward retaliation. By this point, the situation had turned into a cycle. One confrontation led to another, and one other one led to a very another one, and each side pointed to the last incident as justification for the next. The atmosphere in L.A. became volatile. Anger. Both sides pissed. And it was only a matter of time before things escalated into something much larger. You're talking about dead bodies. Evening, June 3rd, 1943. Everything that had been building in L.A. finally broke. 50 sailors stationed in U.S. Naval Reserve came together, already angry over the string of reported assaults on servicemen. This included the recent attack on Seaman Second Class Joe Dacey Coleman, as we said. Instead of waiting for anything official, they formed their own group. They armed themselves with whatever they could find, clubs, belts, other makeshift weapons, and they set out in the city looking for danger.
They moved through downtown and into East L.A., heading straight for areas where Mexican-American youth gathered. Bars, theaters, and busy streets became their targets, especially anywhere Pachucos and Zoot Suits were known. Once they found them, the attacks were direct and aggressive. Servicemen stormed into theaters, pulled young men out of their seats, dragged them into the streets, and beat them. Zoot Suits themselves became part of the target. Victims were stripped of their clothing, and in some cases, these suits were piled up and burned in the streets. Eyewitness accounts from that night described chaos. Groups of sailors moving through crowds, singling people out, and overwhelming them with numbers. Dozens were injured, and most of them were Pachucos. The violence, at least on that first night, was largely one-sided. Still, it wasn't complete without resistance. Some Pachucos fought back using whatever they had, including things like tire irons. Jeez. Ooh. But they were outnumbered and caught off guard by how quickly things escalated.
Right.
The response from the LAPD did little to slow things down, too. Part of that came from wartime realities. The department, they were dealing with manpower shortages.
Right.
There was also clear reluctance to directly confront military personnel.
Mm-hmm.
In many cases, officers stayed on the sidelines and watched rather than even stepping in. They were like, whatever.
Right.
When arrests were made, they were often focused on the very people who just got beat.
Ooh.
Pachucos were charged with disturbing the peace, while the sailors who initiated the attacks were largely left alone. That pattern reflected a broader attitude at the time, where servicemen were given a level of deference as they're about to go fight in the war.
Right.
Even when they were clearly at the center of violence. Like, I just watched you punch this dude 70 times.
Insane.
But, have fun in France.
Right. Son of a bitch. By June 4th, 1943, the violence in L.A. was no longer a series of scattered incidents. No, it had turned into something organized, more aggressive. Groups of around 200 off-duty servicemen, now joined by civilians, began moving throughout the city in coordinated ways. They used about 20 taxi cabs to get around quickly.
I just hired them. Like,
Right.
We'll get out, we'll hop out, we'll punch this dude, we'll hop back in.
They targeted areas like Belvedere Gardens, Bunker Hill. This is where they expected to find Zoot Suiters. And when they did find them, attacks are immediate. Fists, belts, even rope ends
Oh, those hurt too.
were used as weapons. At least 4 Mexican-American youths beaten badly enough to require hospitalization. Over the next very 2 days, 5th and 6th of June, the violence spread even further into East L.A. What had started as groups moving through downtown now turned into full sweeps of entire
Oh,
neighborhoods.
jeez.
Mobs conducted foot patrols, used taxis to move from area to area, actively hunting for targets. Streetcars stopped mid-route so passengers could be pulled off and beaten if they were wearing zoot suits, or even if they simply had a darker complexion. Inside theaters, shows were interrupted so lights could be turned on, exposing everyone in the crowd who fit that very profile. These were not random acts anymore. No, they're targeted. Radio broadcasts helped spread information. Some taxi drivers even offered free rides to participants, which made it easier for the violence to grow.
It's like the Warriors.
Right.
Take it easy out there, Warriors.
Off-duty police officers were reported among those taking part as well. And civilian involvement expanded well beyond the original groups of servicemen. So you got everybody.
Jeez.
Damn. Look at that. At least California's coming together.
Well, right. Well, even if it is against one group. By June 7th, the riots reached their peak. The violence spread into areas like Watts and along Central Avenue. For the first time, there was more organized resistance from the Mexican-American youth. Groups that included Pachuco gangs from Watts began pushing back. They used tactics like alley ambushes and decoys to draw in advancing mobs, turning some of the confrontations into planned defenses instead of one-sided attacks. Smart. They're going to be looking for you. Hey, Chico,
Right.
stand out there. No, man, they're going to get me. No, man, it'll be all right. At the same time, downtown areas like City Hall, 5th and Main, and North Main Street, they were filled with large crowds of servicemen and civilians. In those areas, people were still being pulled from crowds, stripped of their zoot suits, beaten. One of the reported victims was Otis Peterson. By June 8th, a number of... Okay. Good for you, Otis. You made it to our story.
Right.
By June 8th, the number of injuries had climbed around 94 civilians and 18 servicemen. Efforts, they're now being made to slow things down. Naval authorities attempted to impose shore leave restrictions, but those orders were not fully followed at first. About 50 or more Zoot Suiters were beaten on June 8th before stricter enforcement finally confined many servicemen to their barracks, which helped limit how far the violence could spread. Throughout all this, the response from LAPD followed a familiar pattern. More than 500 arrests were made during the riots, and by some accounts, maybe even 600. More than 500 were made during the riots, and by some accounts, over 600 of those were arrested.
Okay.
More than 500 arrests were made during the riots, and by some accounts, a good majority of them were the Mexican Americans. Very few servicemen or civilian attackers were even taken into custody, and if they were released right away. The old violence during what became known as the Zoot Suit Riots wasn't random.
Nope.
Wasn't as simple as targeting entire ethnic groups across, and it was not as simple as targeting entire ethnic groups across the board. The focus was much more specific. Individuals wearing those Zoot Suits, they were the targets. In the end, the pattern of all the things that happened shows the riots were driven less by indiscriminate attacks on entire populations and more just by a targeted focus on a specific style and what it represented. The Zoot Suit became the symbol. Anyone wearing it became a target, even as those being attacked were not entirely passive, and at times pushed back against the violence directed at them. Regarding all the arrests that was one-sided against the Mexicans, this approach was not just speculation after the fact. It was later acknowledged in testimony before the Governor's Citizens Committee. Officers admitted there had been a deliberate hands-off policy when it came to military personnel.
Right.
The reasoning was to avoid conflict between local law enforcement and the armed forces during wartime.
Makes sense.
But in practice, it meant one side was rarely held accountable. By June 7th, not only were soldiers confined to their barracks, but both military police and Navy shore patrol units were deployed into the streets.
Oh.
These patrols were tasked with controlling servicemen and returning them to their bases. The move was pushed in part by Earl Warren, who recognized that the violence was spiraling and needed to be contained. Over 1,000 servicemen were picked up and sent back to their stations during this effort, although very few faced any lasting consequences once they were removed. Well, they needed to go to war.
Right. Wow. With the LAPD maintaining control on the civilian side and military controlling the servicemen, the violence began to taper off. By June 9th, the large-scale clashes had effectively come to an end. The presence of shore patrol and military police made it much harder for mobs to form and move throughout the city. There had been talk of declaring martial law at the time, but that step never taken. The combination of restricted shore leave and active patrols was enough to bring the situation under control. This marked the end of the Zoot Suit Riots at their peak intensity, even though the underlying tensions that caused them still very much in place. In the aftermath of the riots, some officials, they moved quickly to investigate. But the conclusions they reached said a lot about how the situation was being viewed at the time. Because on the 1st of July, 1943, California Governor Earl Warren appointed a citizens committee to look into the causes of the violence and recommend ways to prevent it from ever happening again. And when the report was released on July 29th, it did not frame the riots primarily as a racial issue. No, it pointed to what it described as widespread juvenile delinquency among Mexican-American youth.
Of course it did.
Right, especially the Pachuco groups. The report focused heavily on gang rivalries, defiance of authority, and what saw as a breakdown in discipline. It also cited factors like lack of parental supervision, limited access to recreational programs, arguing that these conditions had helped create an environment where conflict could grow. The earlier Sleepy Lagoon case, you ask, is brought up as a key example, presented as part of an ongoing pattern of violence that had already set the stage for something larger. What the report did not do was call for any investigation into systemic discrimination or racial bias. But instead, its recommendations centered on increased supervision of youth, expanded social services, and stricter enforcement against delinquency.
You guys sound stupid.
It's just like us.
Right. At the same time, the military conducted its own internal reviews, particularly within the Navy. By June 9, 1943, shore leave for sailors and Marines, they've already been restricted. Military assessments concluded that the riots were largely driven by frustration among servicemen, especially toward what they saw as open defiance of wartime rules. The Zoot Suit itself became a central point in that thinking, because it could require up to 10 yards of fabric, which was far more than standard clothing allowed under rationing. And it was viewed by many in uniform as a symbol of excess during a time when everybody else was supposed to follow the rules. While the military did acknowledge that some servicemen had taken part in the violence, their reports generally framed those actions as reactions to what they described as provocative behavior by the Pachucos, which included reports of earlier confrontations involving sailors and civilians. No formal court-martials came out of these reviews, disciplined if it happened. It was mostly administrative and limited in scope.
Damn right.
One of the most significant developments tied to all of this came the following year. October 4th, 1944, a California District Court of Appeals overturned all of the convictions from the Sleepy Lagoon case.
All right.
The court found that the original trial had violated due process.
It did.
Pointing to weak evidence,
It was.
prosecutorial bias,
It was.
and restrictions that had prevented defendants from properly consulting with their attorneys.
Exactly what happened.
All 12 of the convicted individuals were released after serving about 2 years.
Good for them.
Good for them. Even so, the ruling stopped short of fully clearing their names and didn't address the broader events of the riots themselves.
And what are you going to do?
Also didn't lead to any prosecutions of the servicemen who had taken part in the violence.
Yeah.
Taken together, these responses show how officials chose to interpret what happened. The focus stayed on behavior, discipline, and wartime compliance rather than on deeper issues that was actually going on.
All right.
Policies that followed reflected that approach, including local efforts to restrict or even ban zoot suits, while broader questions about the inter-ethnic tensions and systemic bias were largely left unresolved.
Yeah, what are you going to do?
And they still are.
Right. As the riots unfolded, the way they were covered in the media played a major role in shaping how the public understood
You don't say.
what was exactly happening. And those perspectives, far from unified. Mainstream newspapers in L.A., especially the L.A. Times, consistently framed Pachucos and Zoot Suit as symbols of juvenile delinquency and gang activity. Their reporting tied the style directly to crime and disorder. June 2nd, 1943 article went as far as calling the Zoot Suit a badge of delinquency and pointed to the associated gangs as the main source of youth crime in that very city. The tone, not isolated. Other English language outlets, including coverage from the New York Times, echoed similar ideas. They described Zoot Suit gangs as groups preying on communities and even targeting servicemen, reinforcing the idea that they were instigators of violence.
Oh, some of them clearly did.
Right. Well, on the other side, Spanish language newspapers in East LA told a very different story. Publications like La Opinión pushed back strongly against the dominant narrative. June 9th, 1943 article rejected the idea that Pachucos were provoking attacks on servicemen, and instead they described them as victims of organized mob violence. These outlets...
Maybe the one on the night of the actual riot, but...
Right. These outlets argue that the English language press was not just reporting on events, but actively inflaming tensions.
You don't say.
They're helping justify the attacks against Mexican-American youth.
You don't say.
That divide extended beyond local coverage and into the national conversation. Public reaction across the country split along ideological lines. Some voices, especially on the political left, pointed directly at racial prejudice as the root cause of riots. Eleanor Roosevelt herself publicly addressed the issue on June 16, 1943. She called out discrimination as a central factor and argued that it was part of a broader failure within American society that could not simply be ignored. Good for you, Eleanor.
But at the same time, more conservative perspectives push a different explanation. Parts of the mainstream press and public discourse, the focus stayed on wartime expectations and behavior. The Zoot Suit was criticized as unpatriotic, especially because it used more fabric. Yes, we know it used more fabric. Within that view, the riots were framed less as racial violence and more as a reaction to what was seen as open defiance and juvenile rebellion. So during a time when the country expected sacrifice from everybody. With these competing narratives circulating, communities on the ground began responding in their own ways. In Mexican-American neighborhoods, some families took steps to protect their children, which included limiting where they went and how they dressed to avoid becoming targets.
All right.
There were also calls for self-policing within the community, with leaders urging families to distance themselves from the Zoot Suit image in hopes of reducing further violence. Well, the way the Zoot Suit riots, they've been remembered over time, has shifted, especially during starting in the late 60s when Chicano scholars and activists, they began re-examining what happened and why. In that interpretation, the riots are not seen as a series of back-and-forth clashes, but as a largely one-sided racial attack carried out by white servicemen and civilians against young Mexican Americans. Of course they would say that. They're the Chicano scholars.
Right.
Focus is placed squarely on Pachucos as victims, young men whose only real offense, in their view, was standing out and refusing to conform during a time when pressure to blend in mainstream Anglo culture was strong. From that perspective, the violence is tied directly to deeper patterns of the anti-Mexican racism that had already been shaping life in L.A. for years. included segregated neighborhoods,
Right.
unequal access to education, and limited job opportunities.
All right.
This interpretation also connects the riots back to earlier events, especially the Sleepy Lagoon case, arguing that the trial and the public reaction to it helped set the stage. In that telling, I like how their interpretation telling. In that telling, the case wasn't just about one incident, but part of a larger system that criminalized Mexican-American youth, and it made it easier for the public to accept violence against them when tensions finally did boil over.
A big reason this perspective became widely known as to how it was carried into popular culture. One of the most influential works was Zoot Suit by Luis Valdez, which premiered in 1978 at the Mark Taper Forum before moving to Broadway in 1979. The first Chicano play that ever reached that very stage. This very play tells a story through the lens of Sleepy Lagoon trial and presents Pachucos as symbols of resistance rather than delinquency. The character, El Pachuco, stands at the center of that idea, representing pride, identity, and defiance in the face of pressure to assimilate. That portrayal did not stay on that very stage. No, it carried over in later adaptations, including a film version in 1981, and into documentaries and educational programs, including those aired on PBS.
PBS.
Over time, this interpretation became deeply embedded in how the riots are taught and remembered, shaping public understanding by emphasizing the role of discrimination and cultural identity in the events rather than focusing primarily on crime or delinquency itself. Supporters of that interpretation often point to the clear imbalance in how the law was applied during that time and even after the riots. More than 500 Mexican Americans arrested, many relatively minor charges like curfew violations, simply just being associated with Zoot Suit culture. While fewer than a dozen white servicemen faced charges, even though they were widely identified as the ones initiating the attacks. That disparity became one of the strongest pieces of evidence used to argue that the system itself was not neutral. They suggested that enforcement was not just about stopping violence. They said that they were the ones doing the attacks. Wasn't the Zoot Suiters started the attacks?
Originally, well, they were kind of going back and forth. The Zoot Suiters weren't blameless because they were definitely going up, and remember they were making comments to the girls and all that.
Right. Well, it's also suggested that enforcement was not just about stopping violence. It was about who was being targeted and who was being protected. Media coverage and another major part of that argument. Critics have pointed out the way newspapers frame Zoot Suiters as dangerous, unpatriotic, disruptive, often using language that painted them as a threat to social order during wartime. Some editorials went even as far as criticizing what they called hyphenated identities and pushing for a strict, unified version of American identity that left little room for cultural difference. Well, in this environment, the portrayal of Pachucos as delinquent outsiders did not just reflect public opinion. No, it helped shape it, reinforcing fear and suspicion toward Mexican-American youth. You better cross that road when you see one coming.
Well, it also places the riots within a broader national context. In 1943, similar racial tensions were erupting in other cities, which included Detroit and Harlem, where violent clashes exposed deep divisions tied to race, migration, wartime pressure. Seen alongside those events, the Zoot Suit Riots became part of a larger pattern of unrest and anti-minority violence across the country during that period. Looking forward, many scholars, they argue that the long-term impact of the riots went beyond the immediate violence. In this view, the events helped spark the shift in identity and awareness among Mexican Americans. What had often been a push toward quiet assimilation began to change into something even more assertive. By the time the Chicano movement took shape in the 60s and 70s, the riots, they were remembered as an early moment that exposed the limits of acceptance and the need for collective action. Pachuco style, once criticized as rebellious or unpatriotic, it was reinterpreted as a form of cultural expression and resistance. It's a way of pushing back against expectations and redefining identity on their own terms.
Damn right.
Mijo. In that sense, the riots weren't just about a violent episode tied to one moment in time. They became part of a larger story about how the community began to see itself differently, moving from being defined by outside perceptions to actively challenging them.
Okay.
Another interpretation, often grounded in contemporary police records and wartime reported, takes a very different view of what led to the riots. In this one, the violence did not come out of nowhere. Instead, it was preceded by a series of documented clashes between the Pachuco groups
Exactly.
and the U.S. servicemen in L.A.
Exactly.
Authorities had recorded multiple incidents involving assaults on sailors and their companions in the months leading up to the riots. These encounters were often tied to ongoing territorial disputes between neighborhood groups or conflicts that started over social interactions, which included disputes involving women. In those reports, Zoot Suiters, they weren't described as passive targets. They're often portrayed as active participants, and in some cases as the ones initiating the confrontations in the first place. Which, come on, obviously, if you have a brain, obviously they weren't just, come on.
Right.
It wasn't just a one-sided thing. Right. Obviously, both people were walking through the streets fucking with each other.
Right, wow.
I mean, you're just an idiot if you say otherwise.
Right. Affidavits, police records, and statements from servicemen at the time describe situations where groups of Zoot Suiters allegedly carried out beatings that were seen as unprovoked by those on the receiving end.
I mean, you can't trust the guys on the receiving end.
Whether or not those accounts fully are accurate, in every case, they contributed to a growing sense among military personnel. Guess what, guys? We're being targeted. That perception fed into a cycle of retaliation. This is where each incident built on the last, and tensions continue to rise. Even the initial outbreak, June 3rd, has been described differently depending on the source. Some eyewitness accounts from that night suggest the violence began after a confrontation between sailors and a group of Zoot Suiters, following an argument involving young women. And that version of events, what followed was not a one-sided attack from the start, but a situation that escalated into reciprocal fighting before spiraling out of control. And during the riots itself, there is also evidence that some Pachucos organized resistance rather than simply trying to avoid the violence. Groups were reported to have such went as far as setting up ambushes. They used decoys. They carried out counterattacks against advancing mobs.
What are they supposed to do?
Right.
Besides, I mean, the ambushes and the decoys, but
right.
At least counterattack it.
Right. Those actions complicate the idea of complete one-sided victimization and instead point to moments where the violence became more bi-directional, even if one side still carried out the majority of the pursuing. Official investigations at that very time lead to this direction as well. Citizens Committee appointed by Earl Warren. They focus heavily on the juvenile delinquency rather than racial prejudice as the central cause. Their findings, pointed to rising gang activity among Mexican-American youth. This is tied to part of the wartime disruptions like absent parents working long hours, or families dealing with economic instability, or just families not being able to control their kids, I guess.
Right. Sociological studies from that era, they expanded on that idea, linking the unrest to broader patterns seen in rapidly growing industrial cities during the war. The concept of urban instability, where traditional family and community structures were weakened, that was used to explain rise in delinquency across multiple youth groups, not just among Pachucos. Yeah, all the kids. You had the greasers, you had the fucking Pachucos, you had whatever black gangs were around there. Bloods and Crips weren't around yet, but officials in L.A. reported increases in vandalism, assaults, and other offenses among young people more broadly, suggesting that what was happening was part of a wider trend rather than something driven solely by ethnic conflict.
All right.
From this point of view, the riots were not simply a racial attack or a one-sided event. They were the result of escalated tensions between groups shaped by crime, perception, retaliation, and the pressures of wartime life.
Just two different cultures clashing.
Right.
See how it is, boys.
That interpretation pushes back against simplified explanations like this one this guy just gave.
Right.
And instead frames violence as something that grew out of multiple overlapping factors, which included subcultural identity, social instability, and ongoing conflict between different groups in the city.
Damn right.
By 1942, the war was reshaping everyday life in the ways people could see and feel. And one of the clearest examples was clothing. So now we're going to blame the war here.
Right.
The War Production Board stepped in to control the use of materials, especially fabric, like we know. Their civilian suits were limited to only about 3.25 yards of wool, a restriction that most people had no choice but to follow.
All right.
The Zoot Suit, we know it stood out immediately against those rules with its oversized coat, wide shoulders, and heavily pleated pants. Pleated? Could use 10 yards of fabric or more. Jeez. Yeah, that's a little excessive.
Yeah.
In the middle of the road rationing, that made a visible violation. Government didn't just discourage it. The production of Zoot Suits is banned altogether.
Yep.
The tailors who made them risk fines as high as $10,000. Posters and public campaigns pushed the idea that wasted fabric was hurting the war effort. And that message stuck on to some people, especially military guys.
Right. Yeah, they're pissed. Like, what the hell? Well, as a result, the Zoot Suit became more than just clothing. It turned into a symbol. and not just a positive one in the eyes of many Americans. At a time when people were dealing with ration books, limited supplies, constant reminders to conserve, anyone wearing that much fabric stood out. They're like, look at this motherfucker.
What if they bought it before?
Right. To some, no, they're expected to just give it away. Give it away. To some, it looked like selfishness, and to others, it looked like defiance. Either way, resentment was created, especially toward the young men who wore them. United States servicemen, that perception hit even harder. These were men who were training for combat, preparing to deploy overseas, living under strict discipline, uniform standards. They saw these young men back home wearing flashy suits that broke rationing rules, fed into the belief that the Pachucos were avoiding responsibility. There were reports, some accurate, most of them exaggerated, about draft resistance among certain groups of Mexican-American youth. This added to the fuel of the idea that Zoot Suiters were not just different, but unwilling to serve and protect their community. At this very same time, the broader picture was more complicated. Large numbers of Mexican Americans serving in the military already, 400 to 500,000.
Damn.
But local perception did not always reflect that reality. Places like L.A., attention focused on the visible subculture of Pachucos, and this shaped how people interpreted what they were seeing. Community leaders and older generations sometimes criticized those groups, pointing to behavior they saw as rebellious or irresponsible. Older generations always gonna, no matter what
generation we're in.
Right. Which only reinforced the image of already forming among servicemen and public. All this fed directly into the tension that exploded during the riots. The conflict was not happening in a vacuum. No, it was tied to the pressures of life on the home front. Rationing shortages, crowded housing, long work hours with little pay, constant war news, all over the place. Just nothing ever good.
Let's imagine if social media was back then.
Right. Yeah, just wore people down. Similar conditions were playing out in other cities as well. Detroit had a race riot in 1943. This is where economic strain and competition over resources led to violence, even in places without the same exact cultural dynamics.
Well, in that context, the riots over there can also be seen as an outlet for those pressures. For some servicemen and civilians, confronting Zoot Suiters became a way of enforcing what they believed was proper wartime behavior. The contrast between military uniforms, which represented discipline, and sacrifice, the Zoot Suits, they looked like excess and independence. It made that divide even sharper. Combined with blackout drills, rationing rules, and constant reminders of the war effort, like we said, the expectation was that everyone should be contributing in the same way. Anyone who appeared not to be was going to be standing out. In L.A. in 1943, that attention turned into violence. Well, in the immediate aftermath of the riots, officials in Los Angeles quickly moved to prevent anything like it from happening again. One of the first targets was the Zoot Suit itself. June 9, 1943, the LA City Council passed a resolution banning the wearing of Zoot Suits on public streets, labeling the style a public nuisance that had contributed to the disorder. Jeez.
Yeah, we're getting close to that thin line there, boys.
Right. Anyone caught wearing one could face up to 30 days in jail. In practice, the rule was enforced somewhat informally. Police often used existing charges like disturbing the peace to justify arrest, rather than relying on a clearly defined standalone law. Crackdown didn't last forever, though. As wartime restrictions began to ease, enforcement faded. By 1944, the ban had largely lost its force.
Yeah, what are you going to do, right?
Even so, the message had already been sent. Retailers quickly distanced themselves from the style to avoid even being tied to the violence. At the same time, military leadership, they took direct action to control its own personnel. June 8th, 1943, authorities declared L.A. off limits to enlisted servicemen, effectively confining them to their barracks. That decision played a major role in bringing the riots to an end. Navy Shore Patrol units, they detained sailors found in the city, but when it came to formal punishment, nothing happened.
Right.
Few cases resulted in court-martials, and many incidents were dismissed or minimized under the claims of self-defense. There was also a clear reluctance within the system to pursue aggressive charges against servicemen during wartime.
Right.
Gonna have these guys going in there with good morale. The fallout also brought renewed attention to earlier events, the Sleepy Lagoon case. A citizens committee began looking more closely at how the investigation and trial had been handled, including the role of the LAPD. Concerns about biased policing, mass arrests, and questionable courtroom procedures gained traction as part of that review. Those issues eventually reached the courts. October 4th, 1944, the old California District Court of Appeals overturned the convictions tied to the case like we said earlier. Court pointed to weak evidence, prosecutorial bias, serious irregularities during the trial, which included restrictions placed on the defendants, like not even being able to talk to their lawyers.
I don't think we've ever had a show or a case that didn't have some sort of shenanigans going on in the court.
In the court, yes.
Ridiculous.
Always something, dude.
Ridiculous.
Always something.
Just incompetence or just straight up disregarding the law.
A piece of evidence or something that could sway the case for the defendant, and the judge is like, that's not allowed in my court.
No.
Like, why would it not be? Yeah, shit's corrupt as fuck.
Terrible. 17 Mexican defendants released after serving around 2 years. This is the decision that reflected growing public concern about how the case had been handled. Still, the ruling stopped short of addressing the broader events of the riots or assigning accountability for the violence that had taken place. In terms of long-term impact, changes to policing remain limited. Most reforms focus on handling juvenile delinquency rather than addressing deeper structural issues. This left many of the underlying intentions that contributed to the riots largely unresolved. Over time, the meaning...
Guess what, guys?
Right.
You ain't seen nothing yet.
No. Over time, the meaning of the Zoot Suit Riots shifted well beyond the events of June 1943, especially as later generations began to interpret what had really happened.
Reinterpret.
This happened during the 1960s as the Chicano movement gained momentum. The riots were reframed as more than just a series of violent clashes. In their narrative, they became a defining moment of resistance, where Mexican-American youth pushed back against systemic racism and wartime scapegoating. Pachucos, well, they once portrayed in newspapers as delinquents. They were recast as symbols of cultural pride and defiance. That reinterpretation carried art and storytelling. Most notably, Zoot Suit, the book by Luis Valdez, which presented the events as a story of resilience and identity rather than disorder. That shift in perspective did not stay limited to culture. No, it influenced activism as well. Student organizations like the Movimiento Estudiante Chicano de Aztlan, founded in 1969, it drew on the sense of historical identity to push for ethnic studies and greater political involvement on college campuses. In the labor movement, groups such as the United Farm Workers connected similar themes to their own struggles. They used narratives of wartime discrimination and exploitation to mobilize farm workers. While those connections were not always direct, the shared sense of injustice and identity helped tie different movements together. At that very same time, not everyone agrees with this very interpretation. Some critics argue that framing the riots purely as an act of resistance overlooks important context. Racism.
Oh, no shit.
They point out the documented instances of gang activity, including assaults on servicemen before the riots, and argue that those factors played a role in escalating tensions.
Yes.
Of course it did. In this view, the events cannot be reduced to a simple story of victims and aggressors. No, there were consequences within the Mexican-American communities as well. This included increased police scrutiny, higher arrest rates that affected many people beyond those directly involved. All you had to do is be a Latino walking down the street and whoop, 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 hand on the wall and let us do what we're going to do.
Okay, spread those cheeks, boys.
Right. Smoke boys.
Let's go. Looking at the period after the war, it adds just another layer to the discussion. Roughly 500,000 Mexican-American veterans returned from World War II, and they were able to access benefits through the GI Bill, which included education and housing opportunities. Those programs helped many move into the middle class and integrate into broader American society, white people, even though discrimination did not disappear. That reality complicates the idea of a single continuous narrative of victimhood. In the short term, the riots did have a measurable impact, though. There was a noticeable drop in visible gang activity immediately following the riots, due in part to increased enforcement by the LADPD. Public displays of the style of the Zoot Suits declined. Reports of youth disturbances dropped for just a time. That didn't mean the underlying issues were resolved. By the 50s, similar youth subcultures reemerged in new forms.
As we know about the 50s.
Often referred to as greaser groups, shaped by post-war migration and ongoing economic pressures.
Yeah.
In the end, the legacy of the riots not tied to a single interpretation. It's impossible to. They've been understood as a racial conflict, a cultural flashpoint, a case of juvenile unrest, and a symbol of resistance, depending on who's telling the story.
I have a feeling it has to do with every little thing you just said there.
Right. Each of these perspectives highlights a different piece of what happened, and together they show how one event can take on new meaning as it moves through history.
All right.
More recent scholarship has continued to expand how the Zoot Suit Riots are understood, especially, what more do you have to understand?
Right.
Especially by looking at the voices and roles that were largely overlooked in earlier accounts. In the 2010s, historians like Elizabeth R. Escobedo, she began focusing on Pachucas, which are the female counterparts, and how they fit into the story. In her book, From Coveralls to Zoot Suits, Escobedo highlights how these young women were not just bystanders. They actively challenged traditional expectations around gender by adopting bold fashion, wearing their hair in pompadours, and asserting themselves in public spaces at a time when that kind of behavior was heavily scrutinized. What is a woman doing here?
Right.
Contemporary media often portrayed them as disruptive or dangerous, which only added to the sense of anxiety surrounding the Mexican-American youth during the war years. That attention, in turn, contributed to the overall tension that fed into the riots. By bringing Pachucas into the focus, this research adds another layer to the story, showing how gender, class, and cultural identity all intersected in ways that earlier narratives often ignored, even if some interpretations may lean too far in emphasizing victimhood without fully acknowledging documented involvement in confrontations themselves. Right. I mean, two things can be true at once, guys.
Right. Very easy. Well, at the very same time, newer studies have broadened the scope beyond Mexican-American communities alone. Zoot Suit culture itself, not limited to one group. Filipino Americans, African Americans, they also adopted that style, and they too became targets during the riots. Recent analysis, they have pointed out that many of the attacks carried out by white servicemen did not always distinguish between groups. Anyone wearing that style of clothing was targeted. There are also accounts of interethnic solidarity, including instances where black residents stepped in to defend Zoot Suiters during the attacks, adding complexity to the idea of strictly divided group lines. No, it's the fucking clothes.
Right.
Looking at the data, it helps paint a clear picture of what really happened on the ground. Hospital records from that time show 94 civilians around, most of them Zoot Suiters, treated for serious injuries, compared to 18 servicemen. That imbalance highlights...
Wait a minute. 94 civilians, most of them Zoot Suiters. How many actual Zoot Suiters?
Exactly, like 12.
So, like, whatever, what a shit reporting that is.
Right. This imbalance highlights who bore the brunt of the violence, supposedly. And at that very same time, records of more than 50 reported assaults involving Zoot Suit groups in the months leading up to the riots complicate the idea of the events being entirely unprovoked. Exactly. These kind of details have pushed historians to move away from one-sided explanations, whether those came from earlier media portrayals that exaggerated delinquency or later interpretations that downplayed it entirely. Yeah, you got, I mean, come on. They just...
As moving to today, there has not been a single dominant new theory that replaces everything that came before, because why would there? Instead, the trend has been toward more balance, evidence-based analysis. Historians are placing greater emphasis on verifiable patterns, like gang-related conflicts and territorial disputes, while still acknowledging the role of racial tension. The goal has been to avoid leaning too heavily on only one narrative, especially those shaped by biased source at the time, right? What has emerged from that approach is a more layered understanding of the riots. They weren't driven by a single cause, we know this. They were shaped by overlapping factors, which we have covered a million times. Zoot Suit fashion itself becomes part of the story, representing not just style, but a visible challenge to expectations about conformity and behavior during a time when the country was demanding unity and sacrifice. By the time the old streets of LA went quiet in June of 43, the violence stopped, but nothing really been settled. No clear justice came out of it. No single explanation ever fully held up. Instead, what was left behind was a story that kept changing depending on who was telling it. To some, it was proof of racial hatred boiling over in a city that had been pushing people to the margins for years. To others, it was just a result of rising crime, gang conflict, and a generation of young people clashing with a country at war.
That's exactly what it was.
In reality, it was a mix of all of it.
Yes.
Wartime pressure, cultural identity, fear, pride, anger, and perception all colliding at one time. The Zoot Suit itself became more than just clothing. Turned into a symbol that people could project meaning onto, whether that meant rebellion, disrespect, or self-expression. That's why the story still matters while we're covering it today. Not because it has a clean ending, but because it doesn't. Forces you to look how easily a city can divide, how quickly perception can turn into action, and just how quick the truth can get pulled in different directions long after the violence is over. I mean, the whole last 25 minutes was just spent saying
nothing.
saying this wasn't the cause of one thing.
Right. I mean, we all know what the cause was.
What was it? Tell us.
What?
What was it? Tell us.
The whole cause?
Yeah.
It's cause of rising youth violence. It was the cause of youths being into the military. And it's the cause of these guys now put together in the same areas. So you got these youth in the military like, hey, we're going to war. We're supposed to follow the rules. And you got these other youths who are like, you're just a piece of shit who follows rules. And they're like, no, I'm not. I love my country. And they're like, yeah, we do too, but I'm not going to die for it. They're like, yeah, you're a pussy.
I wonder.
They fight. It wasn't because they're Mexican or anything like that.
You're telling me there was no.
There's maybe a little bit. I mean, all those people, there's probably one or two racists in there.
I mean, right. Hey, there was good people on both sides.
Right. I'm sure there was. I'm sure there was some good Zoot Suiters that didn't want violence. They just went along with it.
Got to fit in when you get in.
Yep.
That's going to do it. Zoot Suit Riots. With that, yeah, you guys already know what to do. Like, subscribe, share us with your friends, and review us if you're listening on podcast. Subscribe or like if you're listening on YouTube. And remember, you can join us live.
Live, baby, live.
2 to 3 times a week on our YouTube while we're recording these episodes. We're usually about 3, 4, 5 weeks ahead. So you get a little bit of content that most people aren't going to hear until the day that it's released 5 weeks from now. So with you guys listening on podcasts, you can find us at Bang Dang Network on YouTube. And see you there. Come chat with us. Come see what you don't hear on these edited episodes. So with that, we'll see you next week for a serial killer of something.
Someone's dying.
We'll see you then. Outlaws, Gunslingers, Mother Michiganders.
Bang.